Mother Bear guided paramedics to a crying toddler lost in the woods. What happened next was shocking. Let us know where you're watching from. If you love my content, consider supporting it with a super thanks. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe. It'll help us to remain in touch with amazing people like you. The radio crackled to life at 6:47 p.m., cutting through the quiet of the Riverside Medical Station like a knife through butter. Paramedic Zara Chen was just finishing her coffee when dispatch's voice broke the evening calm. Unit 47, we have a missing child situation. 3-year-old boy, last seen at Cedar Pine Campground approximately 2 hours ago. Family believes he wandered into the forest. Weather conditions deteriorating rapidly. Zara's partner, Marcus Webb, looked up from his paperwork, his face already shifting into that familiar mask of professional concern. They had been working together for 6 years, long enough to read each other's thoughts. A missing toddler in the wilderness as darkness approached was every parent's worst nightmare and every paramedic's greatest challenge. Copy dispatch, Unit 47 responding, Zara replied, already grabbing her gear. The drive to Cedar Pine Campground took 23 minutes through winding mountain roads. Rain had started falling an hour earlier, turning the evening mist into a thick, suffocating blanket that seemed to swallow their headlights. Marcus gripped the steering wheel tighter as they navigated the narrow curves, both of them thinking the same thing, but neither saying it out loud. A 3-year-old boy alone in these woods overnight would likely not survive. When they arrived at the campground, chaos greeted them. Sheriff's deputies had already established a command center near the main entrance, their radio chatter mixing with the worried voices of volunteers who had shown up to help search. The boys' parents, David and Elena Rodriguez, stood near a picnic table where their camping gear lay scattered, as if they had dropped everything the moment they realized their son was missing. Elena's eyes were red and swollen from crying. She clutched a small blue blanket in her hands, holding it like a lifeline. "His name is Tommy," she said, as soon as she saw Zara and Marcus approaching. "He's 3 years old, he loves trucks and dinosaurs, and he's wearing a red Superman shirt and blue jeans." David wrapped his arm around his wife's shoulders, his own face pale with worry. "We were setting up camp. Elena went to get water from the spigot and I was unpacking the car. When we turned around, he was just gone. We called for him, searched everywhere around the campsite. It's like he just vanished." Zara knelt down to Elena's eye level, her voice soft but professional. "Mrs. Rodriguez, I know this is terrifying, but we're going to find Tommy. Can you tell me exactly when you last saw him?" "Around 4:30, Elena whispered. "He was playing with his toy truck right next to our tent. He's never wandered off before. Never." Sheriff Thompson joined their group, his weathered face grim. "We've got search teams heading into 3 different sectors of the forest. The problem is these woods stretch for miles, and with this rain, tracking is going to be nearly impossible. We've called in a helicopter, but visibility is too poor for aerial search right now." Marcus checked his equipment one final time. "Which sector do you want us to take?" "North Trail," Thompson replied, pointing toward a narrow path that disappeared into the dense trees. "It's the most likely direction based on the campsite's layout. But I have to warn you, that area gets pretty wild, pretty fast. There are steep drops, thick underbrush, and—" He paused, glancing at the parents before continuing in a lower voice. "We've had bear sightings in that area recently. A mother with cubs." Zara felt her stomach tighten. A missing child was dangerous enough. A missing child in bear territory changed everything. As they prepared to enter the forest, Elena grabbed Zara's arm. "Please," she whispered, fresh tears streaming down her face. "He's all we have. He's our whole world." Zara squeezed her hand gently. "We're going to bring him home." The forest seemed to swallow them whole the moment they stepped off the main trail. Ancient pine trees towered overhead, their branches so thick that even in daylight the forest floor remained in perpetual twilight. Now, with evening approaching and rain falling steadily, their flashlights created dancing shadows that seemed to move and shift with every step. "Tommy!" Marcus called out, his voice echoing through the trees. "Tommy, can you hear us?" They walked for 30 minutes, following the faint trail deeper into the wilderness. Zara's radio occasionally crackled with updates from other search teams. No sign of the boy yet. The helicopter was still grounded due to weather. More volunteers were arriving at the command center. The trail began to narrow and climb upward. Zara felt sweat mixing with rainwater as they navigated around fallen logs and through thick patches of undergrowth. Every few minutes they would stop and listen, hoping to hear a child's voice calling back to them. It was during one of these listening breaks that they heard it. Not a child's voice, but something else entirely. A low, rumbling sound that seemed to come from deep within the forest itself. Marcus grabbed Zara's arm, pulling her to a stop. They stood frozen, listening. The sound came again, closer this time. It was unmistakably the sound of a large animal moving through the brush. "Bear," Marcus whispered, reaching for the bear spray attached to his belt. But the sound stopped suddenly, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to press against their eardrums. Even the rain seemed to fall more quietly, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Then they saw her. She emerged from behind a massive oak tree like a shadow-given form. The mother bear was enormous, easily 6 feet tall even on all fours, her dark brown fur glistening with rainwater. But it wasn't her size that made Zara's breath catch in her throat. It was the way she was looking at them. Most bears, when confronted by humans, would either flee immediately or show signs of aggression. This bear did neither. She stood perfectly still, her small, dark eyes fixed on the 2 paramedics with an intensity that was almost human-like. Her ears were forward, alert but not defensive. She wasn't showing her teeth or making any threatening gestures. She was watching them with what could only be described as purpose. "Don't move," Marcus whispered through gritted teeth. "Don't make eye contact." But Zara couldn't look away. There was something in the bear's posture, something in the tilt of her massive head that seemed almost expectant, as if she was waiting for them to understand something. The bear took a step forward, and Marcus's hand tightened on his bear spray. But instead of charging or showing aggression, she did something that defied everything they knew about wild bear behavior. She turned around and began walking away, but not quickly, not in flight or fear. She moved with deliberate slowness, pausing every few steps to look back over her shoulder at them. "What is she doing?" Marcus asked, his voice barely audible. Zara watched as the bear stopped completely about 20 feet away and turned to face them again. This time, she noticed a movement in the shadows behind the massive animal. A smaller shape emerged from the underbrush. A cub. The baby bear couldn't have been more than a few months old, its fur lighter than its mother's and still carrying the fuzzy appearance of youth. It stayed close to its mother's side, occasionally looking toward the humans with bright, curious eyes. The mother bear made a soft chuffing sound, then began walking again, still looking back at them. The message was unmistakable. She wanted them to follow her. "This is insane," Marcus muttered. "Bears don't behave like this. This goes against every piece of training we've ever received." Zara found herself taking a step forward, then another. "Marcus, what if she knows where Tommy is?" "That's impossible. She's a wild animal, not some kind of rescue dog." But even as he said it, Marcus was following behind Zara. Something about the bear's behavior was too deliberate, too purposeful to ignore. It was as if she was trying to communicate with them, trying to tell them something important. The bear led them off the main trail and deeper into the forest. The terrain became more challenging, forcing them to climb over fallen logs and navigate around thick clusters of ferns and underbrush. All the while, the mother bear maintained her steady pace, always staying just far enough ahead to be visible, but never so far that they might lose sight of her in the dim light. The cub trotted alongside its mother, occasionally looking back at the humans following behind. At one point, it let out a small, playful growl and pounced on a pine cone, rolling with it in the wet leaves. The normalcy of the gesture was somehow reassuring in this surreal situation. They had been following the bear for about 15 minutes when she suddenly stopped. She had led them to a small clearing where the trees formed a natural circle around a patch of open ground. In the center of the clearing was a large boulder, and scattered around it were several smaller rocks that formed a rough semicircle. The bear sat down on her haunches and looked directly at them. Then she made a sound that Zara had never heard before from a wild animal. It was almost like a whimper, soft and plaintive, filled with what sounded like genuine concern. "Do you hear that?" Zara whispered. Marcus was already reaching for his radio when they both heard it, faint but unmistakable. The sound of a child crying. The crying was coming from somewhere beyond the clearing, deeper in the forest where the trees grew so thick that their flashlight beams could barely penetrate the darkness. But it was definitely there, a weak, frightened sound that tugged at both of their hearts. The mother bear stood up and began walking toward the sound, still moving with that same deliberate pace. The cub followed close behind, and after a moment's hesitation, so did Zara and Marcus. As they moved deeper into the trees, the crying became clearer. It was definitely a young child, and the voice matched the age Elena Rodriguez had described. Tommy was somewhere ahead of them in the darkness, and somehow, impossibly, this wild bear had led them to him. "This doesn't make any sense," Marcus said quietly as they carefully picked their way through the underbrush. "How could she possibly know where to find him?" Zara didn't have an answer. Nothing about this situation made sense according to everything she knew about wilderness medicine, search and rescue, or animal behavior. But she was beginning to suspect that there was more to this story than a simple lost child case. The bear had stopped again, this time behind a thick cluster of evergreen trees. She was standing very still, her massive head tilted as if listening. The crying was much closer now, just on the other side of the trees. Zara moved carefully around the cluster of pines, her flashlight beam sweeping the ground in front of her. What she saw made her heart skip a beat. There, huddled against the base of a large fir tree, was a small boy in a red Superman shirt. Tommy Rodriguez was alive, but barely conscious. His clothes were soaked through from the rain, and his lips had a bluish tinge that immediately told Zara he was suffering from hypothermia. He had stopped crying when their flashlight found him, but his eyes were unfocused and glassy. "Marcus, get the thermal blanket," Zara called as she rushed to the child's side. "And call it in to command. We found him." As Marcus radioed their location to the command center, Zara knelt beside Tommy and began her assessment. His pulse was weak and rapid, his breathing shallow. His core temperature was dangerously low, and without immediate treatment he wouldn't last much longer in these conditions. But as she worked to warm the child and stabilize his condition, she became aware of something else. The mother bear hadn't left. She was still there, standing about 10 feet away, watching them work. The cub was beside her, both animals completely still and silent. It was then that Zara noticed something that made her blood run cold. Around the tree where they had found Tommy, the ground was disturbed. Not from the child's movement, but from something much larger. Paw prints. Big paw prints that formed a rough circle around the spot where Tommy had been lying. The mother bear hadn't just led them to the child. She had been guarding him. For how long, Zara couldn't say. But the evidence was clear in the disturbed earth around the tree. The bear had been walking in circles around the lost child, keeping watch over him while they searched for help. "The helicopter is en route," Marcus reported, finishing his radio call. "ETA is 15 minutes. How is he?" "Severe hypothermia, but he's stable for now," Zara replied, wrapping Tommy in the thermal blanket and holding him close to her body to share her warmth. "We need to get him to the hospital as soon as possible." As she held the tiny boy, feeling his shallow breathing against her chest, Zara looked up at the mother bear. The massive animal was still watching them, her dark eyes reflecting the beam of their flashlights. There was something in that gaze that Zara couldn't quite put into words. Intelligence? Yes, but something more than that. Something that seemed almost maternal. The sound of helicopter rotors in the distance broke the spell. The rescue team was coming, and Tommy would soon be safely on his way to the hospital. But even as help arrived, the mother bear didn't move. She continued to watch over them, as if her job wasn't finished yet. It wasn't until the helicopter had landed in the clearing they had passed through earlier, and Tommy was safely loaded onto a stretcher, that the bear finally turned away. As the rescue team prepared to carry the child to the helicopter, Zara looked back one last time. The mother bear and her cub were disappearing into the forest, melting back into the shadows as if they had never been there at all. But the memory of what they had witnessed would stay with Zara and Marcus for the rest of their lives. A wild bear had saved a human child's life, and in doing so, she had changed everything they thought they knew about the boundaries between species, between wild and civilized, between animal instinct and something that could only be called compassion. 3 days later, Zara couldn't stop thinking about what had happened in the forest. She sat in the hospital cafeteria, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly while staring out the window at the parking lot. The official report had been filed. Tommy Rodriguez was recovering well from his hypothermia and would be discharged later that evening. The search and rescue operation had been declared a success, but the questions remained. Marcus found her there, sliding into the chair across from her with his own cup of coffee. "You're thinking about the bear again, aren't you?" Zara nodded. "I can't get it out of my head, Marcus, the way she looked at us. The way she led us directly to Tommy. It's not normal animal behavior." "Maybe she was protecting her territory," Marcus suggested, though his voice lacked conviction. "Maybe the kid wandered into her area and she was trying to get rid of the problem. By leading us to him? Come on, Marcus. If she wanted to get rid of a problem, there are much easier ways for a bear to handle a 3-year-old child." The words hung heavy between them. They both knew what Marcus was implying, and they both knew it didn't explain what they had witnessed. Dr. Sarah Kim approached their table, her white coat pristine despite having just finished a 12-hour shift. Sarah had been the attending physician when Tommy was brought in, and she had become curious about the unusual circumstances of his rescue. "Mind if I join you?" she asked, already pulling out a chair. "I've been wanting to talk to you both about the Rodriguez case." Zara straightened in her chair. "Is Tommy okay? Is there something we missed?" "Tommy is fine," Sarah assured them quickly. "But there's something strange about his condition when you brought him in. Something that doesn't quite add up." She pulled out a medical chart from the folder she had been carrying. "When a child Tommy's age is exposed to the elements for 3 to 4 hours in those conditions, we expect to see certain things. Severe hypothermia, yes. Dehydration, certainly. Cuts and scratches from moving through the underbrush. probably some injuries from falls. Sarah spread the chart on the table. But look at Tommy's intake notes. Yes, he had hypothermia, but it wasn't as severe as it should have been given the time exposure and weather conditions. His core temperature was low, but not dangerously so. And here's the really strange part. She pointed to a section of the chart. He had virtually no injuries, no cuts, no scrapes, no bruises consistent with a 3-year-old wandering alone through dense forest. It's almost as if something had been protecting him from harm the entire time. Zara felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the hospital's air conditioning. "What are you saying, Dr. Kim?" "I'm saying that the medical evidence suggests that Tommy wasn't wandering around lost for 3 hours. The medical evidence suggests he was staying in one place, probably for most of that time, and that something was keeping him warm." The three of them sat in silence for a moment, each processing the implications of what Sarah had just shared. Marcus shook his head slowly. "That's impossible. Bears don't behave that way toward human children. They just don't." "Maybe not," Sarah said quietly, "but something did." Later that evening, Zara found herself driving back toward Cedar Pine Campground. She couldn't explain why she needed to return to the place where it all started, but something was pulling her back to those woods. The rational part of her mind said she was being foolish, that she should be at home resting after the emotional toll of the rescue mission. But the rational part of her mind had been having a hard time making sense of anything since that night in the forest. She parked in the same spot where they had set up the command center 3 days earlier. The campground was nearly empty now, with only a few scattered tents visible in the dim light of the setting sun. The Rodriguez family had packed up and returned home the day after Tommy's rescue, eager to put the traumatic experience behind them. Zara grabbed her flashlight from the glove compartment and walked toward the trail that had led them into the forest that night. She wasn't sure what she was looking for exactly. Maybe she just needed to see the place again with fresh eyes, to convince herself that what had happened was real and not some stress-induced hallucination. The forest seemed different in the early evening light. Less threatening, perhaps, but no less mysterious. She followed the main trail for about 20 minutes before branching off in the direction the bear had led them. Her memory of that night was crystal clear, despite the darkness and stress of the situation. She found the first clearing easily enough, the one where the bear had first stopped and made that strange, plaintive sound. Standing there now, in the relative calm of a clear evening, Zara noticed things she had missed in the chaos of the rescue. The ground around the large boulder in the center of the clearing was disturbed, not just from their passage 3 nights ago, but more extensively. It looked like animals had been using this spot regularly. Large animals. Zara knelt down and examined the ground more closely. The paw prints were still visible in the soft earth, though the rain had washed away some of the detail. But there were more prints than she remembered. Many more. It looked like multiple bears had been here. Recently. A rustling sound in the trees around the clearing made her freeze. Slowly, she straightened and turned toward the sound, her flashlight beam cutting through the growing darkness. 3 bears emerged from the forest. Zara's heart hammered in her chest as she recognized the mother bear and her cub from 3 nights ago. But now there was a third bear with them. This one was larger than the mother, with darker fur and broader shoulders. The father, perhaps. The 3 bears moved into the clearing with the same deliberate, purposeful manner that the mother had shown when leading them to Tommy. They didn't appear aggressive, but the sheer size and number of them made Zara acutely aware of how vulnerable she was standing alone in the middle of their territory. The mother bear approached the boulder in the center of the clearing and placed something on top of it. Something small and blue. Zara squinted in the dim light, trying to make out what it was. As her eyes adjusted, she felt her breath catch in her throat. It was Tommy's toy truck. The one Elena Rodriguez had mentioned when describing what her son had been playing with just before he went missing. The bear stepped back from the boulder and looked directly at Zara. Once again, there was that strange intelligence in her dark eyes, that almost human-like awareness. She made a soft chuffing sound, similar to the one she had made that night in the forest. Then all three bears turned and disappeared back into the trees, leaving Zara alone with the toy truck and 1,000 questions she couldn't begin to answer. With trembling hands, she retrieved the truck from the boulder. It was definitely Tommy's. She recognized the small chip on the roof and the faded Superman sticker on the side. But how had the bear gotten it, and why was she returning it now? As Zara walked back toward her car, truck clutched tightly in her hand, she noticed something else. Along the trail, at regular intervals, she found small piles of leaves and pine needles arranged in neat circles. They looked deliberately placed, not natural formations. It was as if something had been marking the trail, creating waypoints. By the time she reached her car, Zara's mind was racing with possibilities, each more incredible than the last. She pulled out her phone and called Marcus. "You're not going to believe what just happened," she said when he answered. "Try me," Marcus replied. "After what we went through 3 days ago, I'm willing to believe just about anything." The next morning, Zara and Marcus met with Dr. Kim at the hospital. Zara had brought Tommy's truck with her, and she recounted her experience in the forest the previous evening. Dr. Kim listened intently, occasionally asking questions, but mostly just absorbing the strange details of the story. "I think we need to talk to someone with more expertise in animal behavior," Dr. Kim said finally. "I know a wildlife biologist at the university who specializes in bear behavior, Dr. Elena Vasquez. She might be able to help us understand what we're dealing with." 2 hours later, they were sitting in Dr. Vasquez's office, surrounded by books, research papers, and photographs of various bear species. Dr. Vasquez was a woman in her 50s with graying hair and intelligent brown eyes that reminded Zara somehow of the mother bear. After listening to their account of the rescue and Zara's return to the forest, Dr. Vasquez was quiet for a long moment. She picked up the toy truck from her desk and examined it carefully. "In 25 years of studying bear behavior," she said finally, "I have never encountered anything quite like what you're describing. Bears are intelligent animals, certainly. They're capable of problem-solving, tool use, and even what appears to be empathy within their own species. But this level of interspecies cooperation and apparent emotional intelligence is unprecedented." She set the truck down and leaned back in her chair. "However, there have been isolated reports over the years of similar incidents. Bears appearing to help humans in distress. Most of these reports are dismissed as anthropomorphism or misinterpretation of normal bear behavior, but your account has medical corroboration and multiple witnesses." "So, what do you think happened?" Marcus asked. Dr. Vasquez smiled. "I think you encountered a bear who decided, for reasons we may never fully understand, to protect a human child. The fact that she returned the toy suggests a level of cognitive understanding that challenges our current knowledge of bear intelligence." She paused, then continued. "There's something else you should know. This area of the forest where you found Tommy, it's been significant to the local bear population for decades. It's what we call a traditional use area. Bears have been denning, foraging, and raising cubs in this specific region for generations. If these bears have been observing human activity in the area for years, they may have developed a more sophisticated understanding of human behavior than we previously thought possible." Dr. Vasquez pulled out a thick binder filled with research papers and photographs. "There's been some preliminary research into what we call cross-species empathy in large mammals. the idea that animals can recognize distress in other species and respond with helping behavior. It's controversial, but the evidence is growing. She opened the binder to a page filled with photographs of bears and what appeared to be various wilderness settings. These photos were taken by trail cameras in this same forest over the past 5 years. The university has been conducting a long-term study of bear behavior in this area. Zara leaned forward to examine the photographs more closely. Most showed single bears or mothers with cubs engaged in typical bear activities, foraging, drinking water, or marking territory. But one photograph near the bottom of the page made her heart skip a beat. It showed the mother bear and her cub, the same ones who had led them to Tommy, standing in the exact clearing where Zara had found them last night. But they weren't alone in the photo. There was a third figure in the picture, partially obscured by shadows, but clearly visible. It was a small human child, standing between the mother bear and her cub. But according to the date stamp on the photograph, this picture had been taken 6 months ago, long before Tommy Rodriguez had ever come to Cedar Pine Campground. Dr. Vasquez noticed Zara's sharp intake of breath and followed her gaze to the photograph. When she saw what Zara was looking at, her face went pale. "I've never seen this photograph before," she said quietly. "This camera position was set up by one of my graduate students. The images are automatically uploaded to our database, but we only review them periodically. I must have missed this one in our last batch review." She lifted the photograph for a closer examination. This child appears to be older than Tommy Rodriguez, maybe 4 or 5 years old. Marcus frowned. "Are you saying this bear has helped other lost children before?" "It's possible, Doctor," Vasquez replied slowly. "We would need to cross-reference this with missing person reports from the area. If there have been other incidents like this, other children who went missing and were found under unusual circumstances." She trailed off, but the implication was clear. If the bears had been helping lost children for months or even years, then what they had witnessed wasn't a one-time occurrence. It was part of a pattern. Dr. Vasquez immediately began making phone calls, reaching out to local sheriff's departments and search and rescue coordinators to ask about any unusual child rescue cases in the area over the past year. What she discovered over the next few hours would change everything they thought they knew about the bears of Cedar Pine Forest. In the past year alone, there had been 5 reported cases of missing children in the area surrounding Cedar Pine Campground. All 5 children had been found within a few hours, all in the same general area of the forest. All had been in remarkably good condition considering the circumstances of their disappearance. And in each case, search teams had reported unusual wildlife activity during the rescue. Bears that seemed unafraid of humans. Bears that appeared to be leading rescuers toward the missing children. The pattern had gone unnoticed because each incident was handled by different rescue teams, filed in different jurisdictions, and treated as isolated cases. No one had connected the dots. Until now. As the sun set on what had been one of the most extraordinary days of her career, Zara found herself back at Cedar Pine Campground. This time, she wasn't alone. Marcus was with her, along with Dr. Vasquez and 2 of her graduate students who had brought professional-grade camera equipment and motion sensors. They were going to spend the night in the forest, hoping to document the bear's behavior and perhaps gain some insight into the mystery that had consumed their thoughts for the past week. As they made their way along the now familiar trail, Dr. Vasquez shared more of her theories about what they were witnessing. "Bears have an incredibly sensitive sense of smell," she explained. "They can detect hormones and chemical signatures that indicate fear, distress, even specific medical conditions. It's possible that these bears have learned to associate certain scents with human children in trouble." But why would they care? Marcus asked. What evolutionary advantage would there be for a bear to help human children? Dr. Vasquez smiled. That's assuming this behavior has to have an evolutionary advantage. We're learning more and more about animal consciousness and emotional complexity. Sometimes behavior can't be explained purely by survival advantage. Sometimes it's just about compassion. They set up their observation post in the first clearing, the same spot where Zara had encountered the 3 bears the night before. The graduate students positioned their cameras and motion sensors while Dr. Vasquez and the paramedics settled in to wait. The forest at night was a symphony of sounds they hadn't noticed during the rescue mission. Owls called to each other through the darkness. Small mammals rustled through the underbrush. In the distance, a fox barked, the sound sharp and wild in the cool night air. They waited for 2 hours before anything happened. The first sign was the sudden silence. All at once, the normal nighttime sounds of the forest ceased, as if every creature was holding its breath. Dr. Vasquez motioned for everyone to remain perfectly still. Then they heard it. Footsteps. Not the heavy pad of bear paws, but the light, irregular footfalls of a small human being. Through the trees, illuminated by the pale moonlight filtering through the canopy, they saw a child. The little girl couldn't have been more than 4 years old. She wore a pink pajama set and carried a stuffed rabbit clutched tightly to her chest. She was walking slowly through the forest, clearly lost and frightened, occasionally calling out in a small, scared voice. "Mommy? Daddy? Where are you?" Zara's heart broke at the sound. She started to rise, instinctively moving to help the lost child, but Dr. Vasquez grabbed her arm and held her back. "Wait," the biologist whispered. "Let's see what happens." As if summoned by the child's cries, 3 shapes emerged from the darkness. The mother bear, her cub, and the larger male bear they had seen the night before. The child froze when she saw them, but she didn't scream. She didn't run. The mother bear approached the little girl slowly, making soft chuffing sounds that seemed almost like words of comfort. The child stood perfectly still as the massive animal drew near, as if some instinct told her she was in no danger. What happened next would be burned into Zara's memory forever. The mother bear gently nuzzled the child's hand with her massive snout, then turned and began walking in a specific direction. The little girl, as if understanding perfectly, followed. The cub trotted alongside her, occasionally brushing against her leg in what could only be described as a gesture of affection. The male bear brought up the rear, constantly scanning the forest for potential threats. They were escorting the child, protecting her, guiding her home. Dr. Vasquez activated her radio, contacting the campground's emergency services to report the missing child and her location. But as they watched the strange procession disappear into the trees, they all knew they had witnessed something that would change the way they thought about intelligence, empathy, and the connections between species. The little girl was reunited with her frantic parents 30 minutes later, found sitting calmly in the campground's central clearing with her stuffed rabbit, seemingly no worse for wear after her adventure in the forest. When asked how she had found her way back to the campground, she said simply, "The nice bears helped me." Her parents assumed it was a child's imagination trying to make sense of a traumatic experience, but 4 adults hidden in the forest knew better. As dawn broke over Cedar Pine Forest, Zara sat on a fallen log and watched the sunrise paint the trees in shades of gold and amber. Dr. Vasquez sat beside her, both women lost in thought about what they had witnessed. "How long do you think they've been doing this?" Zara asked. "I don't know, Doctor," Vasquez replied. "Maybe years, maybe decades. Maybe this behavior has been passed down through generations of bears, and we're just now becoming aware of it." She paused, then continued. "There are indigenous legends from this area, stories told by the Native American tribes who originally lived here. Stories about guardian spirits in the form of bears who protected lost children and guided them home. I always assumed they were just mythological tales. And now, Dr. Vasquez smiled. Now I'm not so sure what's myth and what's reality. Over the following weeks, word of the bear's behavior began to spread. Dr. Vasquez published a preliminary paper about her observations, which caught the attention of researchers around the world. The local sheriff's department began implementing new protocols for child search and rescue operations in the area, specifically taking into account the possibility of beneficial bear intervention. But perhaps most importantly, the management of Cedar Pine Forest began developing new conservation strategies designed to protect the bears and their traditional use areas. The clearing where Tommy had been found was designated as a protected habitat, off limits to camping and hiking. The bears had saved more than just lost children. They had saved themselves by demonstrating a level of intelligence and compassion that made their protection a priority for the scientific community and local government. 3 months after Tommy Rodriguez's rescue, Zara received a package in the mail. There was no return address, but inside she found a hand-drawn picture clearly created by a young child. It showed 3 bears and 2 people standing together in a forest clearing. At the bottom, in crayon letters, someone had written, "Thank you for believing." She never found out who sent it, but she had a pretty good idea. Zara framed the picture and hung it in her office, where it served as a daily reminder that the world still held mysteries that couldn't be explained by medical training or scientific knowledge. Sometimes the most profound truths were found in the spaces between what we think we know and what actually is. The bears of Cedar Pine Forest continued their silent guardianship, protecting the lost and guiding them home. And somewhere in the depths of that ancient wilderness, a mother bear watched over her cub and taught it the old ways, the important ways. The bears of Cedar Pine Forest continued their silent guardianship, protecting the lost and guiding them home. And somewhere in the depths of that ancient wilderness, a mother bear watched over her cub and taught it the old ways, the important ways. The ways of compassion that transcended species, of protection that knew no boundaries, and of love that connected all living things in ways humans were only just beginning to understand. 6 months after the Tommy Rodriguez rescue, Zara received an unexpected visitor at the medical station. The woman who walked through the door looked to be in her 70s, with silver-streaked hair woven into a long braid and wearing a beaded leather jacket that spoke of Native American heritage. Her eyes were sharp and knowing, the kind that seemed to see beyond the surface of things. "Are you Zara Chen, the paramedic who rescued the boy from the forest?" the woman asked, her voice carrying a slight accent that Zara couldn't quite place. "Yes, I am." Zara set down the inventory form she had been reviewing. "Can I help you?" The woman smiled, and Zara noticed the expression transformed her weathered features into something almost youthful. "My name is Margaret Whitehawk. I am from the Anishinaabe tribe, and my grandmother once lived in these mountains before the government moved us to the reservation. I think it is time someone told you the true story of the guardian bears." Zara felt her pulse quicken. Over the past months, she had tried to move on from the events in the forest, but questions still haunted her dreams. Dr. Vasquez had published her research paper, which had received significant attention in wildlife biology circles, but many questions remained unanswered. "Please, sit down," Zara said, gesturing to a chair. "I'd love to hear what you have to say." Margaret settled herself with the careful movements of someone who had lived a long life close to the earth. "What I'm about to tell you has been passed down through 7 generations of my family. My great-great-great-grandmother was the first to know the bears." She paused, seeming to gather her thoughts before continuing. In 1847, during the harsh winter that our people call the time of no sun, my ancestor's young daughter became lost in a blizzard. The child wandered into these very mountains, and my great-great-great-grandmother searched for days until the cold and exhaustion forced her to take shelter. Margaret's eyes took on a distant look, as if she were seeing events that happened more than a century ago. She had given up hope when the bears found her, 3 of them, led by a massive mother with cubs. The bears led her to a cave where her daughter was sleeping peacefully, warm and unharmed. The child told her family that the mother bear had shared her body heat and brought her fish to eat. Zara felt goosebumps rise on her arms. What happened to the child? She grew up to become a medicine woman, someone who could speak to the forest spirits. Before she died, she made a sacred pact with the bears. She promised that her people would protect the bear families and their territory, and in return, the bears would watch over any lost child who entered these woods. Margaret reached into a leather pouch hanging from her belt and withdrew something wrapped in soft cloth. My great-great-great-grandmother left this as proof of the pact. She unwrapped the cloth to reveal an ornate silver pendant in the shape of a bear. The metalwork was incredibly detailed, with tiny turquoise stones forming the bear's eyes. But what made Zara's breath catch was the small marking etched near the bear's paw. It was identical to a distinctive scar she had noticed on the mother bear's left front paw during their encounters. This pendant was made by my ancestor to depict the exact bear who saved her daughter. She spent weeks observing the bear family to capture every detail perfectly. The scar on the paw came from an old injury, probably from a fight with another bear. Zara stared at the pendant, her mind racing. But Margaret, that was over 170 years ago. Even if bears live longer than we think, there's no way the same bear could still be alive. Margaret's smile was cryptic. Who says it's the same bear? Before Zara could ask what she meant, Marcus entered the station, stopping short when he saw their visitor. "Marcus, this is Margaret Whitehawk," Zara said. "She's been telling me about the history of the bears in Cedar Pine Forest." Margaret studied Marcus for a moment, then nodded as if she approved of what she saw. The young man has kind eyes. He can hear the rest of the story. She tucked the pendant back into its cloth wrapping but kept it in her lap. The pact my ancestor made was more than just an agreement. It was a spiritual bond that connected her family line to the bear families of this forest. Each generation, the knowledge and responsibility has been passed down. "What kind of responsibility?" Marcus asked, settling into a chair next to Zara. "To watch over the bears, to protect their sacred places, and to ensure that the pact is honored. For over a century, someone from my family has lived near these mountains, serving as a bridge between the human and bear worlds." Margaret's expression grew sad. "But times changed. The government forced most of our people onto reservations far from here. Development pressured the bears into smaller and smaller territories. The sacred places were forgotten or destroyed. But the bears kept their part of the bargain," Zara said. "Yes. Even as their world changed, even as fewer and fewer of my people remained to honor the pact, the bears continued to protect lost children. The knowledge has been passed down through their generations, just as it was passed down through mine." Margaret stood up slowly, her movements deliberate and graceful, despite her age. "But now the balance is threatened. Development companies are pushing to expand the campground, to build cabins and lodges deeper in the forest. They want to turn the clearing where you found the boy into a resort parking lot." Zara felt a surge of alarm. "They can't do that. Dr. Vasquez got it designated as protected habitat. Protected habitat can be unprotected if enough money and political pressure are involved, Margaret said grimly. That's why I've come to you. You've seen what I've seen. You know the truth about these bears. Your voice, combined with the doctor's research, might be enough to stop this. Marcus frowned. What exactly are you asking us to do? Margaret walked to the window and gazed out toward the distant mountains. Come with me to the sacred places. Meet the bears on their terms, in their most important spaces. Learn the full extent of their intelligence and their connection to this land. Then, help me fight to preserve not just their habitat, but their purpose. She turned back to them, and Zara was struck by the intensity in her dark eyes. There are things about these bears that even Dr. Vasquez doesn't know. Things that science can't explain, but that are absolutely real. 2 days later, Zara and Marcus found themselves hiking deep into cedar pine forest with Margaret as their guide. They had informed Dr. Vasquez of Margaret's visit and her claims about the bear's history. The biologist had been fascinated and had insisted on joining them, along with one of her graduate students and a documentary filmmaker who had been following her research. Margaret led them off the established trails and through parts of the forest that showed no signs of human presence. The terrain was challenging, requiring them to climb over fallen trees, wade through shallow streams, and navigate rocky slopes that seemed to go on forever. As they hiked, Margaret shared more details about her family's connection to the bears. She told them about her grandmother, who had been the last of her people to live permanently in the mountains, maintaining a small cabin near what was now the edge of the campground. My grandmother could speak with the bears, Margaret said as they paused to rest beside a crystal-clear mountain stream. Not with words, of course, but with something deeper. She understood their language of posture and sound and scent. Dr. Vasquez looked skeptical. I don't doubt that your grandmother had an unusually deep understanding of bear behavior, but actual communication. Margaret smiled. You are a scientist, Doctor. You require proof. I understand. You will have your proof before this day is over. They had been hiking for 4 hours when Margaret finally stopped at what appeared to be an unremarkable section of forest. Pine trees stretched in every direction, their trunks disappearing into a canopy so thick that very little sunlight reached the forest floor. We are here, Margaret announced. Here where? The documentary filmmaker asked, adjusting his camera equipment. I don't see anything special about this spot. Margaret walked to a large boulder, half hidden by ferns and undergrowth. She placed her hands on its surface and began speaking in a language none of them recognized. The words were soft and rhythmic, almost like a song. As she spoke, something extraordinary began to happen. The normal sounds of the forest, birds chirping, insects buzzing, the whisper of wind through the trees, gradually faded away. The silence was so complete, it seemed to have physical weight. Then, one by one, the bears began to appear. First came the mother bear and her cub that Zara and Marcus recognized from their previous encounters, but they were followed by others, a second mother with twin cubs, an enormous male, even larger than the one they had seen before, an elderly female whose fur was streaked with silver. Within minutes, they were surrounded by 7 bears of various ages and sizes. None of them showed any signs of aggression or fear. They simply arranged themselves in a rough circle around the humans, watching and waiting. Dr. Vasquez stood frozen, her scientific mind struggling to process what she was seeing. This is impossible, she whispered. Wild bears don't behave this way. They don't gather in groups like this, and they certainly don't approach humans so calmly. Margaret stopped chanting and turned to face the group. Doctor, you study bear behavior within the framework of what you believe is possible. But what if bear behavior is far more complex and sophisticated than human science has ever imagined? She walked to the center of the circle, moving confidently among the massive animals as if they were old friends. These bears are not just following instinct. They are following tradition. Knowledge passed down through their own generations, just as my people pass down knowledge through ours. The eldest female bear, the one with silver-streaked fur, approached Margaret and nuzzled her hand gently. Margaret stroked the bear's massive head, and the bear made a soft rumbling sound that was almost like purring. "This is Luna," Margaret said. "She is the matriarch of this family group. Her great-grandmother was the bear who saved my ancestor's child all those years ago." Zara felt her worldview shifting in ways she couldn't fully comprehend. How is that possible? How do you know her lineage? Margaret continued stroking Luna's fur. The same way you know your own family history. Through stories, through markers, through connections that go deeper than genetics. Luna turned her attention to Zara and Marcus, studying them with eyes that seemed far too intelligent for any wild animal. She approached them slowly, and Zara found herself holding her breath. The massive bear stopped just inches away from Zara and reached out one enormous paw. With incredible gentleness, she touched Zara's hand. The contact lasted only a moment, but in that instant, Zara felt something pass between them. A recognition. An understanding. Luna then turned to Marcus and repeated the gesture. Both paramedics stood perfectly still, awed by the deliberate nature of the interaction. "She remembers you," Margaret said. "Bears have excellent memories, and she knows that you helped save one of the children under her protection." Dr. Vasquez slowly reached for her camera, but Luna immediately turned toward her and made a huffing sound that was clearly a warning. "She says no," Margaret translated. "This moment is not for documenting, it is for understanding." The documentary filmmaker, who had been quietly recording the entire encounter, found his camera suddenly wouldn't function. He checked the battery, the memory card, all the connections. Everything appeared to be working properly, but the camera remained dead. "Sacred spaces have their own rules," Margaret explained. "Technology sometimes fails here. The old ways and the new ways don't always coexist peacefully." For the next hour, the humans and bears shared the cleared space in a way that defied explanation. The bears showed no signs of leaving, and the humans found themselves oddly comfortable in their presence. They sat on fallen logs and rocks while the bears arranged themselves nearby, occasionally moving around, but always maintaining their calm demeanor. Margaret used the time to share more of her knowledge about the bears. She told them about the complex social structure of this particular group, how they communicated with each other through subtle vocalizations and scent marking, and how they had adapted their behavior over generations to coexist with the increasing human presence in their territory. "They understand that you are not threats," she explained. "They can smell that you are healers, people who help rather than harm. That is why they trust you enough to reveal themselves like this." Dr. Vasquez, still struggling to reconcile what she was witnessing with her scientific training, asked, "But why? Why would they reveal themselves to us? Why risk exposure?" Luna, as if understanding the question, rose to her feet and walked to the edge of the clearing. She disappeared briefly into the trees, then returned carrying something in her mouth. She dropped the object at Dr. Vasquez's feet, then stepped back and sat down. It was a plastic water bottle, dirty and partially crushed, but what made everyone gasp was what was attached to it. A survey ribbon, the kind used by land developers to mark property boundaries. "They know their home is threatened," Margaret said quietly. "They know that you have the power to help them. This is their plea for assistance. The weight of responsibility settled over the group like a heavy blanket. These incredible beings were reaching out to them, trusting them with knowledge that could either save or destroy their ancient way of life. As the afternoon wore on, more amazing behaviors emerged. The cub that Zara remembered from the rescue mission approached the humans with obvious curiosity. Under its mother's watchful eye, it sniffed their equipment and clothing, learning their scents. At one point, the cub stumbled while investigating Marcus's medical bag and let out a small whimper. Immediately, 3 adult bears turned toward the sound, checking on the youngster's well-being. The mother bear gently nuzzled her cub, making soft, reassuring sounds until it stopped whimpering. "They treasure their young the same way humans do," Dr. Vasquez observed, her voice filled with wonder. "The level of care and protection they show is exactly the same level of care and protection they extend to human children," Margaret finished. "To them, a lost child is a lost child, regardless of species." As the sun began to set, painting the forest in shades of gold and red, the bears began to stir. One by one, they approached the humans for what seemed like formal farewells. Each bear made contact, a gentle touch of paw to hand, before retreating into the forest. Luna was the last to leave. She approached Margaret, and the two communicated through a series of soft sounds and gestures that clearly conveyed meaning to both participants. "She says the danger is greater than we know," Margaret translated. "The developers have already begun surveying deeper in the forest, disturbing sacred sites that have been undisturbed for hundreds of years. The bears are being forced from their traditional denning areas." Luna then approached Zara and Marcus one final time. She looked at each of them intently, as if memorizing their faces. Then she made a sound unlike anything they had heard from her before. It was plaintive and urgent, like a mother calling for help. "She's asking for your help," Margaret said. "She's asking all of us to save their home." With that, Luna disappeared into the darkening forest, following the path the other bears had taken. The humans were left alone in the sacred clearing, forever changed by what they had experienced. The walk back to the cars was mostly silent, each person lost in their own thoughts about what they had witnessed. By the time they reached the parking area, it was full dark, and their flashlights created dancing shadows among the trees. Dr. Vasquez was the first to speak. "What we experience today changes everything. This isn't just about protecting a species or preserving habitat. This is about preserving a relationship, a partnership that has existed between humans and bears for generations." The documentary filmmaker, whose camera had mysteriously started working again once they left the sacred clearing, nodded grimly. "I've been documenting human-wildlife interactions for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like this. But without footage of the actual encounter, who's going to believe our story?" Margaret smiled. "Stories don't need video to be true. The most powerful stories exist in the hearts and minds of those who hear them. Your job now is not to provide proof, but to share the truth in a way that others can understand and accept." Over the following weeks, the small group that had visited the sacred clearing worked together to develop a comprehensive strategy to protect the bears and their habitat. Dr. Vasquez expanded her research, using new grant money to conduct more extensive studies of the bear family's behavior and territory usage. Zara and Marcus found themselves becoming unofficial ambassadors for the bears, speaking to community groups, environmental organizations, and anyone else who would listen about their extraordinary experiences. Their credibility as medical professionals lent weight to stories that might otherwise have been dismissed as fantasy. Margaret reached out to tribal councils and indigenous rights organizations, building a coalition of support that framed the protection of the bears in terms of cultural preservation and the honoring of ancient agreements. The documentary filmmaker worked on a feature-length film about the bears, using the footage he'd been able to capture along with interviews and historical research to tell the story of the guardians of Cedar Pine Forest. But their efforts faced significant opposition. The development company, Crestview Resorts, had deep pockets and political connections. They had already invested millions in planning and preliminary surveying for what they called Cedar Pine Luxury Wilderness Resort. The company's lawyers argued that stories of magical bears were nothing more than environmental extremism dressed up in folklore. They presented their own studies showing that bear populations in the area were stable and that limited development would have minimal impact on wildlife. The battle lines were drawn for a fight that would determine not just the fate of a few bears, but the future of human-wildlife relationships in an increasingly developed world. 1 month later, the conflict took an unexpected turn when a corporate executive named Robert Crestview, son of the company's founder, went missing during a hiking trip in Cedar Pine Forest. He had been leading a group of potential investors on a tour of the proposed development sites when he became separated from the group during a sudden mountain storm. Search and rescue teams combed the forest for 3 days. Helicopters circled overhead while ground teams worked in grid patterns, calling his name and searching every ravine and thicket. It was Margaret who found him. Following the same intuition that had guided her family for generations, she led a small search team directly to a small cave about 2 miles from where Crestview had last been seen. He was unconscious and suffering from severe hypothermia, but he was alive. And according to the tracks around the cave, he hadn't been alone. Large paw prints circled the cave entrance, and the area inside showed signs of a large animal having been present. A pile of fish bones near Crestview's feet suggested he had been fed during his time in the cave. When Crestview regained consciousness in the hospital, his first words were, "The bears saved my life." He told an incredible story of being lost and injured in the storm, then being guided to shelter by a massive mother bear and her cubs. He described how the bears had kept him warm with their body heat and brought him fish to eat. "I thought I was hallucinating," he admitted to the reporter who interviewed him. "I mean, bears don't behave that way. Everyone knows that. But I was there, I experienced it. Those animals deliberately saved my life." The story made national news. Robert Crestview, heir to a multi-million-dollar development company, publicly crediting his survival to the bears his company was planning to displace. Within a week, Crestview Resorts announced the cancellation of the Cedar Pine Luxury Wilderness Resort project. Robert Crestview held a press conference where he declared his intention to establish a foundation dedicated to protecting the bears and their habitat. "I've seen what these animals are capable of," he said, standing before a crowd of reporters and environmental activists. "They possess a level of intelligence and compassion that demands our respect and protection. My family's company will not be responsible for destroying something so extraordinary." The victory was celebrated throughout the environmental community, but for those who had directly experienced the bears' intelligence and compassion, it felt like something more than just a legal or political win. It felt like justice. 6 months later, the Cedar Pine Bear Sanctuary was officially established, encompassing over 10,000 acres of protected forest land. The sanctuary not only prevented any future development, but also provided funding for ongoing research into the bears' unique behaviors and the historical connection between the bears and the local Native American communities. Dr. Vasquez was appointed as the sanctuary's chief research director, finally able to study the bears with the resources and time necessary to fully document their remarkable abilities. Margaret Whitehawk became the sanctuary's cultural liaison, ensuring that the traditional knowledge of her people was respected and incorporated into the management of the protected land. Zara and Marcus continued their work as paramedics, but they also served as volunteer guides for the sanctuary's educational programs. They shared their story with thousands of visitors, helping others understand that the relationship between humans and wildlife could be far more complex and meaningful than most people imagined. The bears themselves seemed to understand that their home was now safe. Sightings of bear families became more common throughout the sanctuary, and researchers documented increasingly complex social behaviors that challenged many assumptions about bear intelligence and communication. But perhaps most importantly, the bears continued their ancient role as guardians. Lost children were still brought safely home by gentle giants who understood that protection and compassion were not exclusively human traits. And in the sacred clearing where Margaret had first introduced them to the bear families, a small monument was erected. Not a statue or plaque, but a simple circle of stones arranged around the ancient boulder. The inscription, written in both English and Anishinaabe, read, "Here dwells the wisdom that connects all living things." The story of the guardian bears of Cedar Pine Forest had become more than just a rescue tale or an environmental victory. It had become a reminder that the world still held mysteries worth preserving, connections worth protecting, and love that transcended the boundaries humans had created between species. In the end, the bears had saved more than just lost children. They had saved a piece of wonder in a world that was rapidly forgetting how to be amazed by the extraordinary bonds that connected all living things. 5 years later, on a crisp October morning when the leaves painted the forest in brilliant shades of gold and crimson, Zara found herself walking the familiar trail to the sacred clearing. But this time, she wasn't alone. Walking beside her, his small hand clasped tightly in hers, was Tommy Rodriguez. At 8 years old, Tommy had grown into a thoughtful, curious boy who spoke often of his bear friends. His parents had initially worried about his obsession with the story of his rescue, taking him to counselors who assured them it was normal for children to embellish traumatic memories. But Tommy's descriptions were too detailed, too consistent, and too filled with genuine love to be dismissed as fantasy. "Are you sure they'll remember me?" Tommy asked as they approached the clearing, his voice carrying the same mixture of excitement and nervousness that Zara remembered from her first visit to this sacred place. "I think they will," Zara replied, squeezing his hand gently. "Bears have very good memories." They weren't the only ones making this pilgrimage. Margaret Whitehawk walked behind them, her steps still sure despite her increasing age. Dr. Vasquez followed, along with Marcus and several other people whose lives had been touched by the guardian bears over the years. There was Sarah Chen, now 12, who had been saved by the bears 3 years earlier during a family camping trip. James Wilson, aged 10, who had wandered from a Boy Scout camp and been found sleeping peacefully beside a bear den. And Elena Martinez, aged 9, who had fallen into a ravine and been kept warm by bear cubs until rescue arrived. In total, 17 children had been rescued by the guardian bears in the 5 years since the sanctuary's establishment. Each family had been contacted by Margaret, invited to understand the true nature of their children's salvation. As they entered the sacred clearing, Zara felt the familiar shift in atmosphere. The normal sounds of the forest faded to whispers, replaced by a profound sense of peace and expectation. The ancient boulder still stood in the center, now surrounded by the circle of stones that had been placed there years ago. They waited in silence, the children clustering together with barely contained excitement. Margaret began her soft chanting, the same Anishinaabe words that had summoned the bears years earlier. One by one, they appeared. Luna emerged first, now clearly the grand matriarch of the family. Her fur was more silver than brown, and she moved with the careful dignity of advanced age. Behind her came the next generation, bears who had been cubs during Zara's first encounter, now adults with cubs of their own. but it was what happened next that brought tears to every adult's eyes. Luna approached Tommy directly, moving with purpose and recognition that was unmistakable. The elderly bear stopped in front of the boy and lowered her massive head. Tommy, without hesitation or fear, reached out and placed his small hands on either side of Luna's face. For a long moment, the 8-year-old boy and the ancient bear looked into each other's eyes. Then Luna made a sound none of them had heard before, a soft, musical rumbling that seemed to come from deep within her chest. "She's singing to him," Margaret whispered, tears streaming down her weathered face. "She's singing the old songs, the protection songs." Tommy began to laugh, a sound of pure joy that seemed to resonate through the clearing. "I remember," he exclaimed. "I remember her song." To everyone's amazement, Tommy began to hum along with Luna's rumbling melody. The tune was unlike anything any of them had heard before, yet it felt ancient and familiar, as if it had been waiting in their hearts all along. The other children, drawn by some invisible force, began to approach the bears that were emerging from the forest. Sarah went to a mother bear with twin cubs, the same bear who had guided her to safety years before. James found himself face to face with a young male bear who nuzzled his hand with obvious affection. Each child was remembered. Each bond remained unbroken. Dr. Vasquez, who had spent years studying these bears, watched in amazement as the animals displayed levels of memory, emotion, and recognition that defied scientific explanation. But she had long ago stopped trying to categorize these experiences within the confines of traditional wildlife biology. "They're not just animals," she murmured to Zara. "They're guardians in the truest sense, protectors of something sacred." The gathering continued for over an hour, children and bears interacting with a naturalness that spoke of deep spiritual connection. The adult bears allowed the cubs to play with the human children, a level of trust that was absolutely unprecedented in wildlife behavior. But it was Tommy's continued interaction with Luna that provided the most extraordinary moment of all. As the afternoon sun began to slant through the trees, casting long shadows across the clearing, Luna did something that left everyone speechless. She walked to the edge of the clearing and disappeared briefly into the forest, returning with something in her mouth. She approached Tommy and gently deposited the object at his feet. It was an old, weathered piece of wood, carved with intricate symbols that appeared to be both Native American and bear-like in design. Margaret gasped when she saw it. "That's a talking stick," she said, her voice filled with awe. "My grandmother told me stories about them, but I thought they were legends, sacred objects used in ceremonies to facilitate communication between species." Luna sat back on her haunches and watched expectantly as Tommy picked up the carved stick. The moment his hands touched the wood, something extraordinary happened. The clearing filled with a sound unlike anything they had ever experienced. It wasn't quite music and wasn't quite language, but it conveyed meaning and emotion with perfect clarity. It was the sound of understanding flowing between species, of ancient wisdom being passed to a new generation. Tommy held the talking stick and looked around the clearing with wonder. "She's telling me about the old times," he said softly, "about the first child who was saved and all the children since then. She's telling me that we're all connected, all part of the same family." He turned to Luna, and when he spoke again, his voice carried an authority that seemed far beyond his years. "She says the children who have been saved are special. We're supposed to be bridges between the human world and the bear world. We're supposed to help people understand that we're all part of the same story." The bear made another soft rumbling sound, and Tommy nodded as if he understood perfectly. "She says the talking stick belongs to all of us now," he continued, "all the children who have been saved, We're supposed to use it to tell others about the bears, to help people remember that the world is full of magic and love and protection. Luna rose to her feet and approached each of the other children who had been rescued by bears. She touched each one gently with her paw, as if bestowing some kind of blessing or responsibility upon them. As the ceremony concluded and the bears began to retreat into the forest, Luna took one last look at the gathered humans. Her ancient eyes seemed to hold a message for all of them, a reminder that love transcends species, that protection comes from the most unexpected sources, and that the bonds formed between souls recognize no boundaries. The last thing they saw of her was her massive form disappearing into the golden light filtering through the trees, moving with a grace and purpose that spoke of ancient wisdom and endless patience. As the group prepared to leave the sacred clearing, Tommy carefully cradled the talking stick in his arms. The other children gathered around him, each placing a hand on the carved wood, sealing their connection to each other and to the guardians who had saved them. "We have to tell everyone," said Sarah, her young face serious with determination. "We have to make sure people know about the bears, about what they do for us. We have to protect them the way they protected us," added James. Margaret watched the children with pride and hope shining in her eyes. "The circle continues," she said softly. "The pact between our peoples lives on in a new generation." That evening, as the families returned to their homes scattered across the country, they carried with them more than just memories. They carried a mission: to serve as ambassadors for the guardian bears, to share their stories with anyone who would listen, and to ensure that the sanctuary remained protected for generations to come. Dr. Vasquez returned to her research with renewed purpose, beginning work on a new project that would document not just bear behavior, but the long-term psychological and spiritual effects of bear rescue on human children. Zara and Marcus continued their work as paramedics, but they also became founding members of the Guardian Children Foundation, an organization dedicated to bringing together all the children who had been saved by the bears and supporting their role as advocates for wildlife protection. Margaret, now in her 80s, began training a new generation of cultural liaisons, ensuring that the ancient knowledge of her people would continue to guide the relationship between humans and bears long after she was gone. And in Cedar Pine Forest, the guardian bears continued their ancient vigil. More children were rescued, more families were forever changed, and more proof was added to the growing body of evidence that love, compassion, and protection were not uniquely human traits. The talking stick found its way into schools, community centers, and environmental conferences around the world. Children who had never set foot in Cedar Pine Forest held it and shared their own stories of animal kindness, creating an ever-expanding network of young people committed to protecting the natural world. 10 years after Tommy's original rescue, the Guardian Children Foundation organized a reunion at Cedar Pine Sanctuary. 57 children who had been saved by bears, now teenagers and young adults, gathered in the sacred clearing for a ceremony of gratitude and commitment. Tommy, now 18 and studying environmental science in college, stood before the group holding the talking stick. Around him were young people who had become doctors, teachers, wildlife biologists, and environmental lawyers, all united by their shared experience of being saved by beings who owed them nothing, but gave them everything. "We are the bridge generation," Tommy said, his voice carrying the same authority it had held as a child, but now strengthened by years of purpose and dedication. "We are proof that different species can love and protect each other. We are living examples of what's possible when we recognize that we share this planet with creatures capable of extraordinary compassion." As if summoned by his words, the bears appeared one final time. Luna, now ancient and moving slowly, led a procession of bears that included multiple generations of the guardian families. Some faces were familiar from years past, Others were new, cubs who had been born since the sanctuary's establishment, carrying on the tradition passed down through their lineage. Luna approached Tommy and gently touched her paw to the talking stick. In that moment, everyone present felt it, a surge of connection that linked every human and every bear in an unbreakable bond of mutual protection and respect. The ceremony continued as each young person stepped forward to make a commitment. Some pledged to dedicate their careers to wildlife protection. Others promised to share their stories with the next generation. All vowed to ensure that the guardian bears of Cedar Pine Forest would never again face the threat of losing their home. As the sun set on this gathering, painting the forest in magnificent shades of orange and purple, the bears and humans stood together in peaceful coexistence. Children who had once been lost and vulnerable had grown into protectors and advocates. Bears who had once risked everything to save human young now had their own young protected by human laws and human dedication. The last image burned into memory was Luna, the ancient matriarch, surrounded by cubs who would carry on her legacy, watching as the young human she had helped to shape walked back toward civilization. But they weren't really leaving. They were carrying the forest with them, carrying the bears with them, carrying the message of interspecies love and protection into a world that desperately needed to remember such things were possible. Years later, when Tommy had children of his own, he would bring them to the sacred clearing and tell them the story of the guardian bears. He would place the talking stick in their small hands and help them understand that they too were part of an ancient pact, a promise between species that transcended boundaries of biology and evolution. And somewhere in the depths of Cedar Pine Forest, bears would continue to watch over lost children, guided by an instinct that was part animal wisdom and part divine love. The guardian bears had become more than just protectors of individual children. They had become protectors of wonder itself, ensuring that future generations would grow up in a world where miracles still walked on four paws through ancient forests, where lost meant only temporarily separated from love, and where the boundaries between species dissolved in the face of unconditional compassion. The story of the guardian bears became legend, then myth, then truth lived daily by those who had experienced it firsthand. And every time a child was safely returned to their family by gentle giants who asked for nothing in return, the world became a little more magical, a little more hopeful, and a little more worthy of the incredible love that had been protecting it all along. In the end, the bears hadn't just saved children from getting lost in the forest. They had saved humanity from getting lost in a world that had forgotten how to believe in the impossible. And that, perhaps, was the greatest rescue of all.